Für mich bedeutet der Fluss total Heimat.
For me, the river totally means home. I grew up here and I have my roots here. I just love being by the water and connecting with the flow of the water. I have a very emotional connection to the river.
Der Rheinländer an sich, der ist schon anders. Ne? Also der ist,
Rhinelanders are different to people in Hessen or Bavaria. They really are special. For instance, we have like an informal set of Rhineland basic laws. And one of these laws is that no matter how bad things get, everything will turn out all right in the end. And that is how the Rhinelander is.
Und so ist der Rheinländer.
Rhinelanders like me are very attached to the river. Personally, I just don't think I could live in a city where there's no water flowing.
Wir sind hier aufgewachsen und der Rhein gehört zu uns.
We grew up here, and the Rhine belongs to us. Just look at the panorama here. I really wouldn't want to do without all this, and we really hope that the river will recover from this drought. But we'll have to wait and see what the future holds.
Aber gut, man muss sehen, wie die Zukunft ist.
As you just heard there, the River Rhine is very special to many Germans and Rhinelanders in particular. And the current drought is a stark reminder of just how important this river is. But the Rhine, which flows all the way from the Alps to the North Sea, has of course also played a crucial role in shaping the history and culture of Europe, not just Germany. And so for this episode, I'll be taking a closer look at the different meanings Old Father Rhine has for the people living alongside it. And I've got backup for this.
Hi, Neil. Can you hear me?
Hey, Ben. Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I can, yes. Hi, sorry.
That's Ben Coates, a British-born author who now lives in the Netherlands, close to the Rhine Delta. And one day Ben decided to do a bit of a David Livingstone, and instead of going in search of the source of the Nile River, he decided to travel to the source of the Rhine in the Swiss Alps. And he wrote a book on the experience titled The Rhine, following Europe's greatest river from Amsterdam to the Alps. And what's so special about this trip is that he didn't just hop on a train and do it the easy way. No, he decided to take his time, just like the river, and do the 800 miles on his bike, on foot, and also taking the occasional boat. It took him about 5 weeks, and by the end of it, he had a clearer picture of this iconic river and what it means to the people living on its banks. Ben, perhaps then if we just start at the beginning of your trip, I mean, if I just to sort of, try and set the scene a little bit, the studio that I'm sitting in right now, for instance, it actually looks out over the Rhine. I'm in Bonn. It's a really nice view. And
nice.
The river levels, I mean, they're quite low at the moment, but it's more or less a straightish river. And that's very different from where you started in the Netherlands, right? Where the Rhine Delta is really spread out and pretty complex. Can you perhaps explain to our listeners, how did you get started that day?
Yeah, so, if you look at a map of the Rhine, you'll see that basically, as you say, from sort of Switzerland to the Dutch-German border, roughly speaking, it runs pretty much as a road would with twists and turns, but basically one big main channel that's unmistakably the Rhine all the way, that whole stretch. And then not long after it passes the German border to the Netherlands, it suddenly sort of fractures into this huge delta and into various different smaller rivers with all the different names, the Maas, the Lek, the Oude Rhine, and many others. And in a way, the whole of the southern Netherlands, sort of everything from about Amsterdam downwards, could always be counted as the Rhine Delta. So my own journey started on the Dutch coast, not too far from Hoogland, Holland, which is one of the main points where the Rhine flows into the sea. Then followed that huge waterway up through Rotterdam, huge port city that was terribly destroyed during the Second World War, but has managed to become very rich and industrial and thriving, in significant part thanks to river trade being carried there from Germany and from elsewhere. And then kept going to Utrecht and to the central Netherlands. Fascinating history dating back to the Roman times, when the Rhine effectively formed the northern frontier of the Roman Empire, where the Romans sort of spread north from the Mediterranean, and when they got as far as the Rhine, decided that everything north of there was too boggy and too filled with savages who kept attacking them, so they wouldn't bother going any further. And then kept going from there over the border into Germany, where I learned a bit more about the role the river played in the Second World War, the famous bridge too far, and the battles that were fought over the river then, and then continued on through Germany and so on.
Right. I mean, you touched upon a lot of aspects there. I mean, if we just were to highlight the economic significance just for a bit regarding the Rhine, I mean, it's historically a very important river. As you said, the Romans settled along its banks. There were conflicts over it. Goods and people were shipped up and down, and many cities and towns along its banks became extremely rich as a result. Can you give us an idea of the role of the river in Germany and Europe's prosperity? Because it's quite difficult to overstate just how important it was. Perhaps you've got some examples there.
Yes, it was, and it still is hugely important. I mean, primarily serving essentially as this big smooth highway, where if you were producing, say, wine in France or some heavy industrial goods in Germany, the easiest way to get them out into the outside world was not on a horse and cart or on a truck dragging them at hundreds of miles across Europe, but simply to load them onto a boat, and then it would be almost for free, very smoothly and easily carried down the river to the North Sea and out into the wider world. So, I mean, it's been hugely important in that sense. And if you look at particularly the way Germany's economy has boomed after the Second World War, the famous Röhrgebiet and post-war economic miracle of Germany that everyone talks about so much, the famous industrial output, an enormous amount of that output has actually been channeled out along the Rhine and via Rotterdam out into the wider world. So, and I think it's fair to say that without the river, Germany would be a much poorer place. And it's no coincidence that several of these countries that are connected by the Rhine, Germany, the Netherlands, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, are among the wealthiest, most prosperous countries in the whole of Europe. As you say, in Germany, it's particularly important. I saw there was an estimate by, I think it was the Kiel Institute, that just 1 month of lower water levels in the Rhine would knock 1% off Germany's industrial output. So it's not something that's just an old-fashioned factor of carrying fishermen and Romans hundreds of years ago. It's still hugely important today.
And I mean, would you say, Ben, that, there's something about rivers in general, or the nature of the Rhine itself, do you think that lends itself to sort of the kind of exploring that you did, certain insights that you perhaps can learn by following a river that you can't by other types of travel?
Yes, I think that's right. I think rivers, they're quite easy to sort of neglect or ignore these days. We all travel really by train and plane and car rather than by boat. If we ever do go to a river, it's normally just as a sort of scenic backdrop to have a beer on a Friday evening or something. We don't sort of live intermingled with them in the way that people would have done 100 or 200 years ago. But they are still hugely important to our culture and society and economy. I mean, if you're looking at the Rhine, the amount of freight and trade it carries, the amount of drinking water we get from it, the power that's generated along it, its political role as a border between these hugely important European countries is something that's still that really runs through our lives, even if we don't always realize it.
I guess in a way, I mean, we also take rivers for granted, right?
Yes, I think you're right. It's very easy to take them for granted. It's a bit like the running water in your house or the electricity pylons that carry the electricity to your house. It's the kind of thing which just operates smoothly in the background, and you forget that we're dependent on it at all. And it's only when things start to grind to a halt and there's a sudden drought or flood or some other problems that you suddenly realize, hey, hold on a minute, despite this modern world where we live in, we're all doing everything online and with apps and remotely. These rather old-fashioned things like barges carrying goods down rivers and power stations getting supplied with coal by boat are actually still part of what makes our economy tick.
Ben, coming back to your book, I mean, you wrote that you don't think the Rhine gets the attention it deserves. Why is it, do you think, that it isn't quite as celebrated as other great rivers such as the Amazon?
Well, I mean, to be frank with you, one reason is probably the scale of it. The Rhine is, I think it's just under half as long as the Danube, something like a third as long as the Volga, compared to the Nile or the Amazon or the Congo. It would be counted as a tiny little trickle. So it's not one of the world's mightiest rivers, even though it is obviously sort of hugely important and well known. I also think there's maybe an issue with just the sort of image of it, where if you think of, or at least if I think of the Rhine, or if I talked to the Rhine a few years ago before I started learning more about it, would have thought of something rather sort of Germanic and industrial and wide and grey and flat. And it doesn't quite have this romantic, beautiful image in the way that, say, the Loire or the Seine might have, where you think of them as in much more poetic terms. The Rhine is seen as kind of more industrial and functional, perhaps, which is understandable if you look at the scenery in some places, in the German industrial north, for example, around Düsseldorf or in parts of the Netherlands. But as I mentioned before, there's also parts of it, particularly the middle section in Germany and the southernmost section in Switzerland and Austria, where it's incredibly beautiful, with this sort of gurgling, rocky stream with huge waterfalls and cliff tops and quite spectacular, dramatic scenery.
From your experience, I mean, the river, it's shaped the people, cities and towns along it throughout history. But from your experience, are people along the Rhine very different to other places? What was your impression there?
That's a good question. I think I would be wary of generalizing too much. And, I don't think there's something in the water, so to speak, which makes people hugely different from how they are everywhere else. But I do think, one thing that all rivers do, and the Rhine perhaps does in particular, is it sort of binds together the people who live alongside it. And so you find even in small towns in Switzerland, for example, there's people whose livelihoods depend on goods or on boats going up and down the river from where they are to France or to Germany or to the Netherlands. And you see that all up and down the river, these small communities that might otherwise be thought of as fairly backwater, out of the way places, are quite intimately connected with places on the other side of Europe and other countries. And I think that does foster a sort of internationalism or a globalist outlook in some of those places that you might not get elsewhere. You see a huge variety of languages and cultures spoken along the river, even these relatively smallish towns and cities, thinking of places like Basel or Koblenz, for example, have quite a sort of cosmopolitan international feel to them, and feel quite dynamic and alive in a way that I think smaller towns that didn't have that river connecting them to other communities and other countries might not do.
And if we look also at the cultural significance of the Rhine, also the Romantic Rhine. Just about an hour's drive south of Bonn, there's Koblenz on the Rhine, which is where the Rhine meets the Moselle River, and that's also where the section of the Romantic Rhine starts. It's, it is a very pretty stretch. I was only there last week. Lots of castles and craggy cliffs. And many writers, musicians and artists were inspired and perhaps also still are. Turner, for instance, by the scenery on the Rhine. Can you give us an idea of how the river came to be seen as important for German national identity in the 1800s? Why was nature a draw for people, and what place did the river have in the national imagination?
Yes, it's a great question. And I think one of the things that most surprised me, or should I say was more new to me as I started learning more about the river, was the sheer number of poets and artists and composers and others who've been inspired by the Rhine quite heavily in their careers in the past. Mary Shelley to Victor Hugo, Heinrich Boll, Heinrich Heine.
The air is cool and it darkens, and quiet flows the Rhine. The tops of the mountains sparkle in evening's aftershine. The loveliest of maidens, she's wonderful, sits there. Her golden jewels glisten, she combs her golden hair. She combs it with a comb of gold and sings a song as well. Its strangeness, too, is old and casts a powerful spell. It grips the boatman in his boat.
Wagner, Byron, Coleridge, Wordsworth, all these people spent significant time by the Rhine and ended up writing about it or painting pictures of it or composing music inspired by it. For Germans, I think it played a particularly important role. History is quite complicated, but essentially what happened was when Germany unified in the late 1800s, there was quite a conscious sense that this new unified country needed symbols to help draw it together, as well as a kind of name for the country and a flag and so on. It needed more intangible things, literature, music, imagery, poetry that would help bind the people together. And the people who were sort of producing that output often looked to the past, the idea that Germany was this wellspring of culture that had helped shape Europe at large. There was a lot of natural imagery involved, so a lot of poets and writers were rather obsessed with the wilderness, with lakes, with forests. You have the huntsman as a famous icon of Germany. You could almost see it as a bit like how cowboys in the West and the deserts have become sort of inspirational symbols of the United States at certain times. Rivers and forests and lakes have done that for the Germans, I think, particularly in the 19th century. And the Rhine has perhaps been one of the most powerful symbols for that, a symbol of vitality and fertility. It represented something that was clean and fresh and renewing at a time when Germany was industrializing fast and lots of people were living in crowded cities, unpleasantly polluted situations and so on. Geographically, it formed the border from the old enemy France, which was also a big factor. So I think from sort of, say, the 1870s onwards, the Rhine has emerged as a real symbol for Germany, a real symbol of national pride and of unity. That's inevitably weakened somewhat in more modern times, but it's still there. And if you care to look, there's still countless poems and pamphlets, and think about everything here from the Rheingold and Wagner to the writings of Heinrich Heine, for example. There's a huge amount that still flows from the Rhine.
I mean, you just mentioned also the different nationalities. The Rhine flows through several countries, right? The Netherlands, Germany, France, Switzerland, Liechtenstein. I mean, did you get a sense when you were traveling about these national differences, or was it more like a common thread, that the people living along the Rhine were sort of bound by the Rhine and perhaps were less German, less French, but more, people, Rhinelanders, so to speak?
That's a great question. I mean, each country clearly has their own different relationship with the river. The French, it's famously, it forms one of the borders of France. It's one side of the Pentagon that forms France, along with the Atlantic and the Mediterranean and so on. So it played an important role there, but I don't think it's had quite the same symbolic role in France as it has in Germany. But then, as you say, I think there is also this strong factor of the Rhine sort of tying countries and societies together as a thread, joining them together and making even some sort of fairly small, out-of-the-way towns feel quite intimately connected with other places in other countries. So if you go down to that corner of Europe, for example, where the Rhine flows through Austria, Switzerland, Germany and France in very short order, sometimes it's almost hard to tell which country you're in. Sort of the border crosses back and forwards over the river multiple times. You can change countries 3 or 4 times in the space of 10 or 15 minutes on a bicycle. And there you very much have the sense that the river is this unifying force, and what counts is that the river keeps flowing from one place to the other, and it almost doesn't matter so much which country you're in legal terms.
Did you get a sense that the Rhine was valued for its nature and ecosystems as well, or didn't that really come up during your travels?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, you have to be honest that a lot of the Rhine's importance is economic and comes from the trade that flows along it and the power that's generated from it and the drinking water that comes from it and so on. But it is also a hugely important ecosystem. I spent quite a bit of time in the Netherlands, near Dordrecht, in the sort of swamps and marshes of the delta there, where you have beavers being reintroduced. In southern France and the southern stretch of the Rhine in Germany, there's been a lot of work to reintroduce storks. 30 or 40 years ago, the Rhine was unbelievably polluted. Die Welt at one point called it the biggest sewer in Germany. In 1986, you even had this famous fire at a chemical factory in Basel, which turned the River Rhine water red for a while. So in the past, it's been horribly polluted. Thankfully, in the last 20 years or so, there's been a huge amount of work to clean it up. I think there's something like 60 or 70 species of fish now in the Rhine, so it's a lot cleaner and better than it was. But still, like all rivers or all natural habitats, a very delicate ecosystem, and it's really, I think it's always going to be a challenge that Europe's getting so much of its trade and so much of its heavy industry fueled by this water source that is also a very delicate habitat for lots of wildlife.
How would you say, I mean, looking ahead now, how would you say is the role of the Rhine changing in the 21st century? Is it getting a different meaning, or is it losing relevance?
Well, what's interesting actually, I think, is that I don't think it's changing that much. I mean, you might expect that in this modern world where we're all having our meetings via Zoom and traveling everywhere by high-speed train and plane and all the rest of it, that the Rhine would not matter anymore and would be forgotten about. But in some ways, it's playing now, I think, an extremely similar role to what it was 30 or 50 years ago in terms of still carrying lots of freight and trade, still providing us with lots of drinking water, still generating power, still fueling factories and industrial sites along the river. I think a lot of those roles have continued. And, we can talk about solar power, renewables, for example, but it's still just a fact that a lot of energy comes from power stations alongside the Rhine. And so these forces, I think, will stay the same. What perhaps has changed is I think there's much more consciousness of the environmental side of things. So 30 or 40 years ago, the Rhine and other rivers were treated essentially as sort of open sewer systems that you could just draw water from or throw waste into and not worry about at all. And these days, people quite rightly have a much deeper understanding of the stresses and challenges of running heavy industry in a delicate ecosystem like that. So there's much more awareness of the environmental challenges, much more cooperation between the different countries on the Rhine and different cities on the Rhine to make sure they're not polluting each other's water supply or just chucking waste away that then causes a problem for someone else downstream. And I think thanks to the weather stresses we're having at the moment, that awareness will probably only increase.
Is it the right way to travel the Rhine, to start in the Netherlands and go to Switzerland? Or with hindsight, would you have preferred to have gone the other way and start at the source and expand?
Yeah, that's a good question. I quite like the idea of traveling it in reverse. I mean, partly because I was living at one end of it and it sort of made sense to set out from home. But also, I guess I had this slightly romantic, old-fashioned idea of, Livingston in Africa or whatever, of setting out to find the source of a great river had a certain romantic appeal for me.
And how was it when you reached the source? I mean, was it like an anticlimax, or did you feel deflated, or were you elated that you'd completed the journey? How was that day?
It was quite a special moment, actually, probably more than I had expected it to be too. So to get to the source, you head up on this small little road over a pass in the Swiss Alps, very steep tarmac road. And then at a certain point, you turn off the road and start trekking across the hillside. There is quite remarkably a red lighthouse standing at the top of this pass in Switzerland, which is an exact copy of the one which used to stand at the mouth of the Rhine at Hook of Holland. They've now moved it to Rotterdam, but I had seen that same lighthouse a couple of weeks or months earlier in the Netherlands, and then to sort of suddenly bump into its twin, cloaked in mist and surrounded by patches of snow at the top of the Alps was quite a moment. And then I hiked out across this hillside, very steep and rocky, sort of almost Scottish type appearance with lots of rock and heather and so on, and kept hiking along. By that point, I was pretty tired. I had my dog with me, and I think we were both in need of a sit down and a cup of coffee or something. And it definitely felt like the end of a long journey, which I was looking forward to ending. And then, to my surprise, I suddenly rounded a corner, and there, nestled in this little cleft between the mountains, you have these high snowy peaks, and between them this perfect little patch of blue lake, quite idyllic, almost like a picture postcard Swiss mountain lake. And I was quite blown away by it, actually. I hadn't expected to be. As I said, I was a bit sort of tired and grumpy at that point. But to stand there and see the actual point where the Rhine flows out of this lake, still only perhaps a metre wide, narrow enough to step over, and think that if you tossed a twig or a leaf in at that point, it would flow down through all these places, all these countries, all these cities, right the way across Europe, back all the way home. That was quite a special moment for me.
And you had your dog with you all the time?
Not all the time. She joined me for some sections of it. It's not always terribly convenient to have a dog with you when you're traveling. But I have this hyperactive small dog that I adopted as a stray in Africa years ago, and she's got the travel bug too, so she was very happy to come along for some parts of the journey and have a drink from the source of the Rhine.
You are quite a traveller, right, Ben? So you've seen a lot of major rivers globally. If you were to compare the Rhine to other rivers, do you have a favourite river in the world, or?
Wow, that's a big question. I'm not sure if I have a ranking, sort of swipe right for the Rhine or something. I have a soft spot for the Nile. I think I lived very close to the Nile in Uganda for a while, and there's obviously something similar to with the source of the Rhine, something quite magical about thinking of all the countries and cultures that water is going to flow through, and swimming in the Nile near the source is quite a special experience. But I think the Rhine may have just nudged it out of the top of the list on my part. For me, it's somewhere that has a lot of special memories now. I've seen an awful lot of things, learned an awful lot traveling along it, and I think it's somewhere I'll probably keep going back to in my life.
What is your favourite place along the Rhine? You travelled the whole stretch of it.
Wow, that's a tough call. There's a lot of places that are very beautiful and very special to me. I think I have a bit of a soft spot for Basel, actually, the city in Switzerland that lies very close to the French and German and Swiss borders. Mainly because there's this tradition in Basel of particularly early in the morning, people going for a swim in the Rhine. And you can even, if you want, buy a special bag to put your clothes in that sort of floats while you're swimming along the river.
Did you do that?
And that's quite... I did do that, yeah. It was extremely cold, but extremely beautiful. And for me, that was quite a remarkable moment because you sort of jump into this big, wide, busy river in the middle of quite a big, bustling city, and then just float right down the middle of the river, right through the heart of the city, past the great cathedrals and all the houses and shops and roads and so on.
Okay. Because I've always been told it's super dangerous not to go swimming in the Rhine because of the current.
Well, you shouldn't take your advice from me then, perhaps. I take no responsibility for listeners taking their lives into their own hands. But I found it extremely beautiful, very clean alpine water, very clear.
Okay, maybe this is a different setup in Basel, maybe.
But you didn't get it from me.
Okay, then just one final question. Ben, if there is a particular anecdote, I mean, funny things happen with every journey, especially if you have an extensive trip. I mean, sad things sometimes as well. But if we were to focus on one particular experience that you had, what would it be?
Well, I think probably the oddest experience I had going along the Rhine was I tried to sort of mix up modes of travel a little bit. So I cycled quite a lot of it, but also went on a lot of boats inevitably and did some hiking the hills and so on, and tried to sort of keep things fresh by approaching the river from different angles, so to speak. And one day in Switzerland, I was looking for a certain way to get from point A to point B, and it seemed like the most logical, or perhaps completely illogical way of doing it was to ride on a cow. So there's this tradition in a certain part of Switzerland that instead of riding on a horse, you can ride on a cow, and that's exactly what I did. Got this huge animal about the size of my sofa at home, climbed on top of it and went riding off with a small group of people off through the fields. Beautiful sunny morning alongside the Rhine. The cow at one point actually decided to plunge into the Rhine and walked into the water to cool off with me sitting on its back, frantically pulling on the harness and trying to steer it back out again. So yeah, I'm not sure that's sort of my top recommendation of the easiest way to get across Europe would be by cow, but it was certainly a lot of fun.
Many thanks to author and Rhine expert Ben Coates there. And if you want to get some additional insights from Ben's trip from the Rhine Delta to its source, I do suggest that you check out his book. I mentioned it at the top of this episode, but no harm in doing so again. It's called The Rhine, Following Europe's Greatest River from Amsterdam to the Alps. And just on a personal note, I haven't travelled the entire river from the sea to its source, but I have walked the entire Rheinsteig hiking trail on the Middle Rhine section. It's really lovely and includes the world-famous Lorelei Rock and plenty of castles and vineyards where you can sample the wine. So if you ever make it over to Germany, I would strongly recommend that you check out this trail and that you start just south of Koblenz in Braubach. And just follow the trail to the famous wine village of Rüdesheim. And it's really the nicest section if you can do that. It'll take you several days, depending on how fit you are, but you really won't forget it. And you can also take the boat back, which is also a great experience. So, that's just my 2 cents and doing my bit here for the local tourism board. Many thanks to my colleague and producer Natalie Muller and my sound engineer Thomas Schmidt. And as always, a big thank you to you for listening and sharing on The Green Fence. My name is Neil King. take it easy and take care.
Green